whole thing is creating some problems, but that and more, right? Kind of share with us what is your read on the Chinese economy? What do you think will happen going forward and all that stuff?
China's economy and its overall policy making apparatus. What's interesting about them is that they had several big moves that many would regard as blunders. Policies like the hukou and the one child policy. These policies really shaped the China that we see today. Interestingly, over the past decade and a half, China has tried to backtrack on a lot of these policies. So one child is now first went to two child, and then now there's more like
The
three if you
more,
can
the
have it. Yeah,
better.
yeah.
Yeah.
So they have backtracked on that. Even with the hukou, they have adjusted it dramatically. In some of the attractive second tier cities, it's really liberalizing there as well as they try to get people to be willing to move there. And interestingly, there's been a more recent development where some of the Rust Belt cities, if you will, those in the northeast of China, what used to be Manchuria, they also have been trying to liberalize it as an effort to attract people back into those Rust Belt cities. So in some ways, there is a really dynamic movement in terms of policy to try to address some of these, if you will, policy blunders. But my concern going forward is just how quickly policymakers are responding to these. In the high growth years in China, so in the 90s and the 2000s. But nevertheless, when you have one person that is mostly endowed with the ability to make decisions and the authority to make decisions, the risk of becoming ossified and the risk of people with alternative ideas, with views that are not part of the status quo, it becomes harder for these individuals and sometimes risky for these individuals to voice out.
So would you say this is like a huge structural risk for the Chinese economy going forward?
Huge. And I think we saw it play out in COVID. I think most people, most observers of China in the earlier stages of COVID would have thought that it wasn't poorly managed in the beginning. They were a disciplined policy making apparatus. They managed to shut the borders. They managed to prevent the spread of the disease. And that was necessary at the beginning. Unfortunately, they were slow in doing was to recognize that COVID ultimately would mutate fast enough that it was impossible to completely shut that out from the population. And so it became necessary to live with COVID as we have chosen to do here, as almost every economy in the world now has chosen to do. But China was very slow in coming to that conclusion. And for a long time, they were still betting on their domestic vaccines rather than the more modern mRNA vaccines. And I think slowness really lost them a tremendous amount of time. It stripped the economy of a lot of momentum that they had prior to going in. Of course, we'll never know the genuine counterfactual, but if the economy had been willing to, like many other Asian economies, quickly pivot into living with COVID earlier on, a year earlier, half a year earlier, it would have made a material difference to their prospects today. The economy was just allowed to decelerate so much in the time that they chose with that to have the zero COVID policy, that by the time they decided to reopen, it became really, really hard to fire up the engines again.
Yeah, yeah. So I think I just went to one of the big banks, conferences. They always have these things, right? And I think they were predicting like 5 to 6% growth, and it's like even a question mark whether China can grow at that continued rate. But of course, it is at a different size, But I think everybody's just trying to suss it out, like what's going on here and all that.
One thing to keep in mind about larger economies and developing economies is that a high headline growth number doesn't translate into the same thing that we think about when we think about the growth of advanced economies like the United States or Europe or even more recently Singapore. In many of these developing countries, they're at a stage of their development where, for various reasons, less so in China, but certainly in India, if you grew at 4%, you are just keeping pace with population growth. So you're not getting any richer at all. So in per capita terms, a 4% headline growth rate doesn't make you any more prosperous. In China, it's a little different. As I explained, China is already on the other side of that demographic curve. So of course, a 5% growth rate does increase their per capita incomes, but certainly slower than you would in an economy where, like Japan, where in fact, if anything, the population is shrinking. So even though many people look at Japan's headline growth rate and say, wow, this is terrible. This is only 1%, 1.5%. We're able to eke out 2% in recent times. They think, wow, that's terrible. But when your denominator is also shrinking, then that becomes a lot more impressive. And so the Japanese are indeed still continuing to be relatively more prosperous over time, even with a low headline growth rate.
I want to go